Chapter 3, Food Safety and Sanitation. In this chapter, you will be able to identify the causes of foodborne illnesses, handle foods in a safe manner, explain and follow the HACCP system, take appropriate actions to create and maintain a safe and sanitary work environment. The one thing I want you to recognize from this chapter is that you do have a safety and sanitation course at the college, but the largest thing that you will ever do in this industry is try to keep food safe, inform, train associates, employees, educate your customer, and make sure you follow current food code and safety guidelines. So this chapter is in addition to what you do in your sanitation and safety course, and once you get into your lab classes, you'll find that you are always having to pay attention to safety, sanitation, keeping food safe, time and temperature control, monitoring, all of those things. So this chapter is in your intro to culinary class that you're in because it's important to cross over for each student and the importance of working in the industry, but also working in our kitchens so you can begin to apply the skills and to hear it again and see the importance. So in this lesson we're going to cover some of the material that's the same, and it's not a bad thing to have it repeated so you learn it and see the importance of it. We also might pull out a couple things that in your 8-week 1-credit course may not be covered. The U.S. Public Health Service identifies more than 40 diseases that can be transmitted through food. Many of these cause serious illness, and of course some of them are very deadly. If you were to look at this list and Google it or search it through the government FDA website or even the health website, you would find that HIV and AIDS, for instance, is not listed there because it's not contracted through food, and that's because it can be killed. And I bring that up because it's often a question that students have or employees have a concern of when they haven't been educated to discuss and understand it. Obviously, blood is a contaminant to food. However, the risk factor of the two items I mentioned are not as high a concern, and to date there has been 0 issues of identified people that have contracted it through food contact. Of course, the most important item is protecting customers and providing them with safe food in a sanitary environment, in a safe environment, and that is the food handler's most important responsibility. But unfortunately, though, food handlers are also the primary cause of food-related illnesses, and that's when you're going to find the term cross-contact and cross-contamination come up. Without people, or the food handler or food worker, you would not find cross-contamination very commonly because we are the ones dealing with the food that are handling raw chicken that need to clean properly the station, clean ourselves prior to ever getting a head of iceberg lettuce and working with it, because the lettuce is typically not cooked, which then means the cross-contamination exists and is not reducing the effect of microorganisms that are present that we cannot see that could make somebody ill or cause death. So the definition of sanitation is the creation of and maintaining of conditions that prevent food contamination or foodborne illness. When we look at this, we look at cleaning, we look at sanitation, and then a third level is sterilization or sterile. Cleaning is the removal of visible food particles and other contaminants, while sanitation is reducing microorganisms that we cannot see to safe levels. Sterile, you're going to find that in a hospital, in a surgery room or something along those lines, where the bacteria levels are reduced to 0 or as close to 0 as possible. In a kitchen, we don't need to go that far. So sanitation is the process of removing those microorganisms to a safe level that we can then serve food safely and keep our customers safe as well. Proper hand washing techniques. This is always a hot subject, and we need to ensure that we teach you and you learn how to do it properly and safely, and don't take shortcuts. First step is to use hot water. They say 100 degrees, but typically you can get up to about 105 without it being too hot for people. But the basic guideline is using water as hot as you can stand. And you need to wet your hands and your forearms almost up to your elbow. Second, you apply soap. Antibacterial is suggested, but research proves that that's not 100% necessary. But you'll want to use a good soap, and you want to lather up. You want to rub your hands and arms briskly together, and do that for about 20 seconds, making sure you get under your fingernails, in between your fingers, on the back of your fingers, the back of your palm, or the palm of your hand and the back of your hand, your wrist, and up your forearm. Nail brush, some places have forbode those because they do not get cleaned and sanitized properly. So if you do use one of those, you want to have practices in place to make sure that those are not the cause for contamination and transmitting deadly bacteria and other items that can contaminate food that the food handler can move around. You want to thoroughly rinse your hands and your forearms in hot running water so that the suds, the soap, and the bacteria all rinse away. And then you want to dry your hands and arms with a single-use towel, and use the towel to turn off the water if it has a faucet, or if it's motion censored or activated, and so forth. And of course, discard the towel. The current code says that this whole process needs to last 20 seconds, or singing Happy Birthday to yourself twice. 10 to 15 seconds scrubbing and lathering up, and an additional 5 to 10 seconds of rinsing and then towel drying. Moving from hand washing and safety and sanitation, now let's talk about washing, storing, and keeping our equipment and plateware and utensils clean and sanitary to put food in and or on. With the 3-compartment sinks, which are the only sinks that are to be used for washing, whereas a 2-compartment sink is used for rinsing vegetables, produce, and things along those lines, while a 1-compartment sink is only permitted for hand wash use only. So if you look at this diagram, you're going to see there's a scrape station, a pre-rinse station, a wash station, moving into the middle sink compartment of a rinse, finally a sanitize, and lastly an air dry. So let's cover each one of these. Every time you fill up a sink, it costs money. It costs time, it costs water, and in your wash and your rinse, my apologies, in your wash and your sanitize, you have chemicals that go in there, so that costs as well. At Reynolds, it's about 37 cents every time we fill up a sink of wash water, and about a quarter every time we fill up the sanitizer sink. So the step 1 of this process to scrape is absolutely critical. And at Reynolds, you're not paying for the sinks, you're not counting detergents, but think about your business. If you were the owner, or you open your restaurant or catering, and you have an employee that drains and empties the sink 4 times an hour because it's unnecessary, that's an additional cost every hour, every time they do it. So at Reynolds and in kitchens, you want to use your rubber spatula to scrape out all food solids. Liquids can go down the garbage disposal, and then that pan typically gets pre-rinsed. So at our 3-compartment sinks, we don't really have a pre-rinse, so that scrape station is absolutely critical. Whereas over at the dishwasher, you'll find there is a pre-rinse that you can do that with. When you are scrubbing your pots and pans in the soap water, you want to make sure you clean the inside, the outside, and the handles and the bottom. And then dip it in the water before you move it, and drain it before you move it to the rinse water. You dip it into the rinse water to make sure all of the chemicals are removed of the wash detergent, and then you submerge it into the last sink, which is the sanitizer. Depending on the type of sanitizer that a business uses, there's guidelines that it must be completely submerged from anywhere from 30 seconds to 2 minutes, and so forth. At Reynolds, it's supposed to be submerged for 2 minutes if you look at the sign above that sink. Once it's done, you pull it out and you turn it upside down if you notice in the diagram, and that's because any food contact surface must be protected from things in the air falling into or onto it that could get transmitted to the food. A little bit more about this diagram. With the wash water should be as hot as you can stand, and you change the wash water when it gets cloudy, if it's been 4 hours at max, and or the suds are gone. The rinse water you change if it gets cold, if it's cloudy or there's a lot of food particles floating around in it. Sanitizer, you change it if it's also with the wash sink if it's been 4 hours. With the sanitizer sink, if it has been 4 hours, you change it. You also can check the quat sanitation parts per million ppm to make sure that they're still falling within the range that's necessary. If by chance the water gets cloudy or murky, then you also would need to change it. But proper washing techniques, your rinse and your sanitizer sinks should last 2 or 3 times longer than up to 4 hours than your dishwashing sink. Lastly, when you are emptying these sinks, you need to ensure that you are also washing with soap and water each sink well, the bottom and the sides, and then rinsing those down and then flushing with sanitizer, because sinks get dirty as well, and the food that you washed off of those products are now stuck to the sinks. You also want to make sure you empty and clean the drains and flush those very well. Hence why a 3-compartment sink is not to be used for food. Same reason why you don't use food by draining, dumping, or filling things in a 1-compartment sink that is designed specifically only for hand washing. Foodborne contamination comes in 3 forms. You have biological, chemical, and physical. Biological is going to be something that's living. You have molds, bacteria, yeasts, viruses, and fungi. All of those items are considered a biological hazard or contamination. Chemical is exactly what you think of it. Think of anything you use to clean with, or anything that is not a food substance that you would eat or drink or ingest. So that'd be like cleaning agents, pesticides, and one of the things that falls under here that may be new to you is toxic metals or toxic metal poisoning. And that would be metals that can leach into food that then you ingest through them, like an acidic tomato sauce in an aluminum pan, or pitting in an aluminum pan, or iron and other things like that. Physical contamination is exactly that. Something is physically there that you can see, if you were looking for it obviously, that is contaminating the food, like wood, metal, glass, a staple from the case that the celery came in, got into the celery. It could be a bug or something like that in lettuces and other produce items. We have to protect customers from this, because when they come to our establishment, the idea for them is to fill their belly, lighter pocketbook, but to leave safely and not have to worry about harm. We have to prevent or minimize those risks by handling food safely and knowing the potential dangers. Contamination occurs in 2 ways. You have direct or cross-contamination, and then you have indirect. So direct, the contaminant is naturally occurring in the environment where the food came from, like mad cow disease, toxins in the water that fish ingest, rocks or pebbles in dried beans. It could be, again, pests on your produce, shells from shellfish, or even shells for nuts, and even bones from meat, although a guest doesn't anticipate bones in a boneless piece of meat. If we're not particularly careful, those things could happen, especially cartilage that's a little harder to see and feel depending on what type of meat you're working with. Cross-contamination, as discussed, is the major issue that we have to worry about, and that's because of food service workers. It is a contaminant that's spread from a contaminated food to a non-contaminated food. Our three ways that contamination happens, biological, physical, and chemical, are all spread this way. Our biological contaminants are bacteria, parasites, viruses, fungi, and molds, and they are very direct. Bacteria are physical living organisms along with parasites. Viruses are airborne and need a living host. And then our fungi are like mushrooms and other things like that. Out of the 3,000 mushroom varieties, only 300 of them are edible. And then of course our molds that you have seen. And then you'll see with molds you have two different kinds that we'll see in another slide. Those that cause foodborne illness and those that just cause food spoilage that are not necessarily going to cause foodborne illness to a customer. Bacteria are single-celled microorganisms. They are the leading cause of foodborne illness, and what they do is they reproduce by splitting in half and dividing. If you give them the right conditions, fat ton, food, acidity, time, temperature, oxygen, and moisture, those are the things they need, you'll find that one cell can divide into 72 billion in just 12 hours. That's very important because the one thing I always want people to recognize, if they say they get sick after eating some food in a couple hours or even less, typical foodborne illness takes 24 to 36 hours. So if it happens so quick, you would have probably known not to eat that food because it would have been so spoiled and contaminated. Not always, but often. The other thing to remember is that when you eat something that's spoiled or contaminated and you did not know it, the reason you get so violently sick is it's not just one bacteria sitting there waiting. There could be already 72,000 of them, and then those 72,000 expand in 12 hours. That cause a major issue. Bacteria called putrefactions or factants are not a sanitary concern. They just spoil food. It does not make it unfit to eat. Obviously, nobody wants to eat a molded piece of bread, but the logic here is that you would actually be normally safe to eat that. If you look at country ham, for instance, or even a dry aged beef product, those get mold and things, and that's to flavor the food, enrich it, age it, and so forth, but it does not make people sick if it's properly done. The dangerous bacteria that we always are concerned with in the food service industry is called pathogenic, and those must be destroyed and controlled throughout the food service operation to minimize risk to customers and even associates or employees working for you. And those are those foods that we TCS, time and temperature control for safety, or the other hot button item is the PHF term, potentially hazardous food. And both of those terms mean the same thing, they just say it in a different way. Bottom line, all food, we need to control the time, we need to control the temperature, we need to control the water level or moisture, we need to control the oxygen level, we also need to control the acidity level, and the food that these bacteria would eat, we need to be mindful of that because we can cause an environment for them to grow. In this picture you see the different types of bacteria, Spirillea, cocci, and rods. In this diagram here you can see that one single bacteria growing and multiplying in 10 to 12 hours and the amount that it can produce. Bacteria can cause you to be ill in 3 different ways. First off, you have intoxication. Intoxication, like botulism, is where the actual bacteria is producing a toxin, and the toxin is actually what makes you sick. Second is infection, like Salmonella. Salmonella itself actually makes you sick, not the toxin necessarily. A toxin-mediated infection, if you look at the word itself, toxin and infection, it's combining both of the first two, intoxication and infection. So it's not only the bacteria that makes you sick, but the toxins also make you sick, so it's like a double whammy. Hence why E. coli is so deadly. So if we look at intoxication a little deeper, like botulism, it's not the bacteria, again, that causes the illness. Toxins that bacteria produce are the issue. The problem is you cannot see them, you cannot smell it, and you cannot taste it. Toxins cannot be destroyed by cooking either. Think of just hot toxins, not dead bacteria. The example that I always use to give you a good visual is, think of vomit and then you heat it up. Is it still vomit? Would it still make you sick? Yes. So if a bacteria has already produced toxins, which again you cannot see, smell, or taste, the food is contaminated and will never be fit to eat, because all it is, you've taken the toxins that will hurt people and make them sick and could be even deadly, and just heated them up. So you have to be extremely careful. Infection, like salmonella, the infection happens when bacteria are ingested. They live and thrive in your intestinal tract. That's why a lot of people get stomach cramps or abdomen cramps, if you will. The bacteria and not their waste or toxins cause the illness. They can be destroyed by cooking foods. In this instance, salmonella, cooking it to 165 degrees or above for 15 seconds or longer. You will find when we talk about HACCP, hazard analysis and critical control points, 165 for 15 seconds is the critical control point. One way to remember what a critical control point is by identifying, where do I, as the chef, the cook, the restaurant owner, the business, lose control of that food that I can no longer protect the guest? For instance, if you're grilling a piece of chicken, putting it on a plate and sending it to the guest, it's 165 for 15 seconds when it comes off that grill. If I have a prep cook that's grilling chicken for chicken Caesar salad that they're going to chill, slice up, and serve later, that critical limit is still the 165 for 15 seconds. But when we talk about the flow of goods or flow of food, we've now shifted from the service flow to the prep stage. And that can cause a major difference, or trying to get your employees and even your teammates or yourself to understand the importance of reaching critical limits. A control point is at which point we can control the product. When we receive it, is it the right temperature? Do we store it at the right temperature? When we're prepping with it, do we monitor the time and temperature that we're dealing with it and keep it safe when we cook it, and so forth? Toxin-mediated infection, like Clostridium and E. coli, are examples of this. Characteristics of both of these bacteria include intoxication and infection. So both the bacteria and their toxins cause the illness. It's very dangerous and highly susceptible to those that have weakened immune systems, or our high-risk populations, like the young, the elderly, pregnant, and any other high risk that you can think of.